Hello everyone and welcome back to another episode of the Subcontinent. This program aims to discuss the most significant issues in the subcontinent that affect the governments, communities, organizations and the region as a whole. As usual, we will try to explore and explain its geopolitics, untangle the arguments from different perspectives and make the alternative voices heard.
In this edition of the Subcontinent, we are going to talk about how Hollywood has used mainstream cinema as a propaganda tool in Afghanistan to justify the US military occupation of the country and to manipulate reality on the devastating war. And we shall take a look at how the propaganda films have been used to glorify invading US-led allied forces and demonize local Afghans, and also to reinforce negative stereotypes of Afghans.
Afghanistan has for long been an operational laboratory for its American occupiers, and the mainstream Hollywood films have been tasked to paint a rosy picture of this military occupation, show invaders as heroes fighting the evil and humanize the tyrants and demonize the victims. In the process, they have tried to justify the unjustifiable. The propaganda-driven cinema has been effectively used for mass manipulation. Films like The Outpost, Brothers, Alliance for Lambs, War Machine and Lone Survivor provide justification for America's invasion of Afghanistan by creating sympathy for the American occupying forces and spawning hatred for the Afghans.
From Lone Survivor, which depicts Afghans as savage people while painting US soldiers as heroes, The Outpost, that shows Americans as passive victims and Taliban as aggressors, War Machine, that creates fake sympathy for US forces fighting the so-called good war, to United States of Al, a situation comedy that reduces Afghan victims into one-dimensional villains. Western productions have gone a long way to shape perspectives of the US longest war spanning 2 decades. Most Hollywood productions after the US invasion of Afghanistan in 2001 and the so-called War on Terror propounded by then US President George Bush kept the people of Afghanistan on the periphery while placing the invaders center stage. The idea was to humanize the occupiers and justify their crimes in the name of counterinsurgency. After all, Americans pay to see war films that show their trigger-happy soldiers intimidate, hound, harass and kill the weak and vulnerable. This gaslighting and criminal manipulation of facts over the years led to people in America think US forces were in Afghanistan at the invitation of Afghans to bring freedom and liberty. But the reality dawns late.
American filmmakers have always been condemned for distortion of historical records. Movies such as Windtalkers, The Patriot, Rambo, Black Hawk Down, Pearl Harbor and Jarhead are some of the classic examples of America's propagandist filmmaking. In Afghanistan's context, the failure to decimate the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, which was the stated objective of the invasion, forced Hollywood to attempt damage control at the behest of warmongering politicians in Washington. When military adventures prove counterproductive, cinema comes into play by presenting fiction as reality and serving nefarious political agendas.
Hollywood's portrayal of the landlocked country ensconced in the mighty Hindu Kush Mountains has been far from consistent, reflective of the US political and military somersaults. When the so-called Mujahideen fought the Soviet Army in 1980s, they were hailed as heroes in the US media. On one occasion in 1991, then US President Jimmy Carter's national security advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, was photographed on the front line with Osama bin Laden. A 2007 film, Charlie Wilson's War, starring Tom Hanks, shows US supplying Stinger portable ground-to-air missiles to Afghan fighters. Little did Americans know they would be invading the country many years later to take out their former ally, followed by 20 years of failed war against the tribal fighters who once used to be on the CIA payroll. To think that they could conquer Afghanistan, known as the graveyard of empires, where the British were thrown out in the 19th century, the Soviets were forced to beat the hasty retreat in 1980s, was plain naivety. This issue features in Brad Pitt's starrer War Machine, although it also ends up lionizing the invaders. For 2 decades, as the US military adventurism spawned horrible human rights abuses in Afghanistan, Hollywood tried to cover it up through propaganda, distortion and misrepresentation.
Interestingly, Hollywood filmmakers, despite their uncanny penchant for war and war-ravaged countries, have shot Afghan war films mostly in faraway lands. They have tried multiple locations around the world to recreate the exquisite Hindu Kush vibe, but not always with luck. The most recent is Scott Eastwood's starrer The Outpost, released last year. It was shot in Bulgaria. The film basks in the false glory of military heroism after Taliban fighters ambush a US military base in remote Afghan province. The incident resulted in multiple disciplinary actions, but the filmmakers makes lions out of lambs.
Let's show them some love with the 120s.
You all right, mate? Come on, put your arms around me. You're not gonna die, okay?
RPG! Red platoon!
Peter Berg-directed film The Lone Survivor is perhaps the most high-profile Hollywood film about Afghan war. The movie was released in 2013 and filmed entirely in New Mexico. It tells the story of a lonely survivor in 2015 Operation Red Wings in southern Afghanistan. The movie depicts US soldiers as victims and martyrs in a war they chose and imposed on poor and helpless Afghans.
Going in with a 4-man team. Axelson, myself, Dietz, Marcus.
Take it peek. That's a lot more than 10 guys. That's an army.
Brad Pitt's starrer War Machine is a 2017 war satire shot in locations in Germany. It's about a proud military general tasked with winning an unpopular and unwinnable war in which he obviously fails. As a review in Guardian noted, it's not funny enough to be a satire, not realistic enough to count as political commentary, not exciting enough to work as a war movie.
We are here to build, to protect, to support the civilian population. To that end, we must avoid killing it at all costs. We can't help them and kill them at the same time. It just ain't humanly possible. Now,
12 Strong is a 2017 movie shot in New Mexico, which tells the story of first American soldiers to land in Afghanistan in the days after 9/11. It's an unauthentic drama that raises fundamental questions. Why did the US invade Afghanistan and what they have been fighting for over the past 20 years? No answer to that.
Ain't losing one man on his team. The only way home is winning.
Brothers is a 2009 film by Jim Sheridan, filmed again in New Mexico. It follows a US Marine as he tries to reintegrate into normal life after his release as Taliban's prisoner of war. Again, a desperate and often repeated attempt to humanize the war criminals and rationalize the military occupation.
You know, your dad saved me in that water when we were little kids. You know you're like your dad?
Last but not least, Lions for Lambs, featuring Meryl Streep and Tom Cruise, is a high-profile Afghan war film shot in Washington, D.C. and California. It connects a platoon of US soldiers in Afghanistan, a US senator, a reporter, and a California college professor. Like other filmy projects, this too has an unimpressive plot that seeks to romanticize forces of occupation.
After 2 decades of military occupation, US-led Allied troops are all set to beat a retreat from the South Asian country. The protracted war that commenced after 9/11 attacks, with the US looking for a scapegoat for its own security failure, has been a subject of many war productions, tasked with a painstaking job of justifying the war and making America's illegal military adventures sound legitimate. After the cataclysmic 9/11 events, the advocates of war and foreign military invasions in Washington devised a plan to rope in Hollywood as part of its propaganda for America's so-called war on terror. These films vilified not only the Taliban but also ordinary Afghans in order to show Americans as good guys. High on propaganda and low on substance, these propagandistic cinematic ventures sought to sell war as something moral and noble by reducing its victims to one-dimensional villains and pushing forward the unexciting story of white saviors. Looking at Hollywood's long archive of war propaganda and its history of acting as agents to post-9/11 US empire, the goal has been to romanticize the diabolical military project in Afghanistan and turn it into a moral imperative in the eyes of American public. But not all endings are happy. This project also failed to produce the desirable results, as is apparent from reams of media coverage about the US defeat and Taliban's resurgence in recent months.
Now to have more insight, we are joined by Kenneth Farrow, Professor of Media Studies and documentary filmmaker. First of all, welcome to the program, Professor Farrow. As we mentioned earlier, Hollywood's portrayal of the war in Afghanistan has sought to hide the reality from viewers and try to downplay US failures in the country. Now, do you think that makes Hollywood complicit in US war crimes in the country?
Well, the United States is no different to any other country that's at war, whether it creates the war or whether it's defending itself. Uses film, media, television, literature. It uses this whole culture to justify its position. And we've certainly seen that in terms of Afghanistan. And we have to remember also, in terms of the war in Afghanistan, this is not something that began in 2001. It began in the 19th century with the British. There were 3 wars here against Afghanistan, which the British lost. And ever since then, we've had European, Western countries trying to invade the country. And so that's the context of what we're seeing. And of course, culture plays its role in politics. It plays its role in terms of trying to win the battle for the hearts and minds of the people. Because any war has to be won, not just in the field in terms of weapons, but it has to be won with the population. And the Americans have certainly, and certainly Hollywood, has done its very best to support the position of its successive administrations in their invasion in the war of Afghanistan. And it goes back to movies like Rambo with Sylvester Stallone, very famous series about an Afghan, a Vietnam War vet who then goes to Afghanistan. And so we've seen movie after movie over the past 20 years which try to justify the US invasion, occupation, and destruction of this country.
Professor, in most Hollywood ventures, we see American soldiers shown as brave, patriotic, and selfless, while Afghans are portrayed as primitive, terrorists, and villains. Now, is that a strategy to create sympathy for the occupiers and detestation for the victims?
Well, the dehumanization of a people is part of the strategy of war. And we've seen that across the history of mankind. One day, countries may be at peace. The next day, they'll be at war. And those people in that country will change in the eyes of the media, in the eyes of the press, from civilization to something barbaric. And we've certainly seen in the depiction of Afghanistan, the depiction of the people, the attempt by the United States to justify its invasion when it tries to frame the invasion of this country in terms of trying to defend it against the Taliban and bin Laden. This is quite ridiculous because everybody knows underneath the real story is that the Americans want to occupy Afghanistan because of its mineral wealth. because it's of its mineral wealth and the resources there. And so when you're talking about the possibility of trillions, really a few movies from Hollywood is nothing for the Americans. Hollywood has always supported, in general, the position of its administrations. And we've seen that in drama after drama after drama. Documentaries are a bit more nuanced, and so we can have films about atrocities in Afghanistan, but of course they don't have the same popularity as the movies which show the destruction and the bombing and the killing of barbarians. And I think this kind of a vengeance which is held by Hollywood and promoted by Hollywood, again goes back hundreds of years. We have to remember Rudyard Kipling's poem about being left on the plain of Afghanistan and being cut by Afghan women, a very famous poet in Britain who also wrote The Jungle Book, a very famous racist book. So this is all connected to the racist attitude of Hollywood, not just to Afghanis, but to anyone in the Middle East, anyone in Africa.
Thank you, Professor Ferro. Let's take a break and look at how the global media has covered Hollywood's portrayal of the Afghan war.
Hollywood loves to make war movies. Some are resoundingly patriotic and optimistic despite the carnage, while others are frank about the ambiguity of American wars and even about their uselessness. Afghanistan has presented Hollywood as it has the American people with a tremendously difficult, if not impossible, task. Fighting in Afghanistan has pulled the public here from one extreme to the other. When the Mujahideen battled the Soviet army from 1979 to 1989, Afghan fighters were heroes in the US because they killed our most dangerous enemy, the communists. As the news about the US ending its 2-decade-old war in Afghanistan gains momentum, it is time to look at how the 20 years of conflict have impacted the people of Afghanistan and the ones who fought it, not just on ground, but also on screen and on pages after pages of literature. Films have gone a long way to shape perspective of these 2 decades, from the jingoistic Hollywood fare that only seemed to only care for American lives and push the country's agenda to a more nuanced portrayal that truly looked at the human cost of the conflict.
Professor, some would argue that justification of war and expensive military occupation in films is meant to prevent American taxpayers from standing up against their government for spending their money to pay for bombs, missiles and bullets. Now, I wanted to see your take on this.
Well, war is about profit and filmmaking is about profit. Well, some elements of it, certainly Hollywood, is all about profit. And so Hollywood is trying to make money out of the situation. Of course, they'll try to justify and support the invasion of Afghanistan and the brutality there through their storylines, through their heroic, through their invasions and through what they try to depict to people. But it also has to be said that these movies that have been made over the past 20 years are not that successful in theaters. Most Americans reject these movies. Unfortunately, a large part of the American public tend to believe Donald Trump and his kind of attitude, and we can see that expressed in terms of the movies around Afghanistan. There have been several very well-known films which have depicted the situation in Afghanistan as one of the cowboys coming to attack the Indians who are out of control. And so really the westerns of John Ford have been replaced by the war movies of Matt Damon and the other characters that we see gallivanting across Afghan plains and the Afghan mountains, and clearly the fact that these movies are really not very well made and not received well in terms of the public is an indication of how poor the storyline is, because people can see it's full of lies and stories are based on truth.
Professor, Hollywood has forced Americans to accept that they are part of a genocidal empire, as we see in films like Argo and Zero Dark 30, which employ propaganda tools to distort events in Iran and Afghanistan. Do you think the purpose of such propaganda movies is to create hate against the perceived enemy?
Well, I think film can be used as by the powers that control the resources to justify their actions. And certainly we've seen this in Afghanistan in terms of the American Hollywood system. There have been very few films which have dealt with the truth of Afghanistan. There have been very few films which have dealt with what's actually going on there, which is a people are trying to defend themselves against an invader. And of course, this is not the image of the war. And of course, this is based on the American supremacy, the white supremacy, which Americans believe in and try to promote.
Now, most Americans have certain racial stereotypes against Afghans, which are cultivated and reinforced by cinema. What's your take on this?
The depiction of Afghan and Afghanistan is part of the Orientalist approach of the culture of the United States and of Europe. This idea of the Orient as somewhere exotic, barbaric, something that has to be civilized, a people who have got no morality, has been defined by authors like Edward Said for many, many years. And we've seen that depiction of Afghanistan for over 100 years, if not by the Americans, by the British, as a brutal land with a brutal people. And of course, it doesn't reflect the culture of Afghanistan. It doesn't reflect the fact that this is a culture that goes back centuries. And so this is something which they have to attack very, very heavily, because they can't possibly go to war in a country which has got civilization as Afghanistan has. And so they try to justify this by demonizing and brutalizing the image of Afghanistan in a very racist way. And so this creation of the other, of the subhuman, is all part of the Orientalist approach, which ties in obviously with the kind of white supremacy that we see dominating a lot of American culture. And of course, Hollywood and movies are part of that culture. They reflect not just the position of the government. They don't just reflect what's happening outside in the world. They also reflect the feelings and the thoughts of the American people, which to most people watching these movies is quite frightening, that they can have these views and go along with this propaganda.
Professor Hitler's propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels believed in the power of cinema to influence people's thoughts. Americans seem to have borrowed the same idea. How powerful do you think cinema is in manipulating reality and shaping people's attitudes?
Well, cinema and media in general is a way of controlling people. If you tell a population every day through its cinema, through media, that there can be no change, there can be no hope, they will believe you. And so cinema has been used as a way of controlling people. It's also been used in war. We know there's a very strong correlation between the development of cinema and cameras and the use of them in propaganda in terms of war. For example, in the Second World War, the development of small cameras was because of the war. It wasn't because of the filmmaking, the needs of filmmakers. And so the correlation between war and filmmaking is very, very close. And of course, what we've seen in terms of propaganda and how that works is that, again, the demonization, the creation of the other, the subhuman, this has been part of not just Nazi propaganda, but propaganda in general. And of course, some American movies do borrow from that.
Professor, and finally, according to you, how is war related to politics, and how does it serve US interests across the globe?
War is a business. Politics is a business, and that's a connection. It's really all about capitalism, the need for power, the need for control. And so war is not a separate item from politics. Robert McNamara, who was the defense secretary during the Vietnam War, Korean War, basically said that there were 10 lessons with war and politics. And it was all about controlling the minds of people. It's all about what people will accept. How many deaths will they accept? Will they accept 10, 20, 30, 1,000, 100,000? And so this balance between politics and war.
On that note, I would like to thank Professor Ferro for his precious time and knowledge. And that was our episode on Hollywood being used as a tool of propaganda in Afghanistan to justify the illegal US military occupation while glorifying the invaders and demonizing the victims. To keep track of all the happenings in the subcontinent, follow us on social media platforms, and don't forget to give us your feedback. We shall meet again, same time, same day next week. So till then, take care.